Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. Welcome to another Christian Apologetics episode. And in this episode, rather than continuing on with the evidence that corroborates the Gospels, that make us understand that they are reliable eyewitness testimony regarding Jesus, I'm gonna stop a little bit and I'm gonna try to use this video to answer to some objections that I've been facing, after I uploaded the last video. In the last video, I talked about the early dating of the Gospels and all the evidence that we have, circumstantial evidence, reasoning, logical reasoning, that we can argue and reasonably conclude that the Gospels were written earlier than what most skeptic scholars say, and that they were written within the first generation of eyewitnesses, and therefore that we can trust that the testimonies, the accounts that they narrate, are actually direct eyewitness testimony. Remember, the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They contain eyewitness testimonies, right? So that's a big difference. And especially Luke just is very clear in making this point, that he's just reporting, right? He's reporting eyewitnesses' testimonies. Like he wasn't an eyewitness himself. He was just reporting eyewitnesses' testimonies. And now the main reason, so like the question really, the objection for an early dating of the Gospels was really this one. Why are the Gospels dated so late by skeptics and by especially atheists or agnostic scholars, right? So why are they dated so late in the first century? Like, is there any reason to date them that late? And the answer is actually a very surprising one, because there is no historical evidence that supports the claim that the Gospels were written after 70 AD. There is just no evidence. There is no historical evidence. Actually, there is evidence of the contrary. But why do then that most skeptic scholars agree on the fact that the Gospels were written so late? For a very, very particular reason. The fact that in the Gospels, Mark, Luke, Matthew especially, there are some historical events that are predicted to occur, like a prophecy. So predicting the future. And because, of course, they're skeptical, because they have this bias against supernaturalism, and because they believe that supernaturalism cannot be true, and that naturalism is the only thing that exists. Therefore, no one can predict the future. It's not possible to perform miracles or to predict the future, to predict a future event. And therefore, that the Gospels must have been written after the historical events happened, and then they manipulated the Gospels to make them appear as if Jesus, in this case, had made the prediction. But in reality, they wrote the Gospels after the event predicted. So can you see here the reasoning? Because of the fact that they have a bias against supernaturalism. Supernaturalism cannot be true. The Gospels contain historical events that are predicted to occur, but because no one can predict the future, then it concludes the fact that the Gospels were written after the historical events happened, and then they were manipulated in a way as to give to Jesus some kind of power or supernatural ability to predict the future, right? So that's the actual objection, and that's the argument for this late dating of the Gospels. Like there is, as I said before, there is no historical evidence that argues that the Gospels were written after 70 AD. There is just no evidence. It's just this philosophical claim based on the content of the Gospels that make the most skeptic scholars to date them so late. And now, if you look for Google and you try to search this, dating of Gospels, you're gonna find, of course, Wikipedia that reports the skeptics, scholars' dates, right? You can see here Mark being 70 AD, very, very late. Matthew and Luke, of course, following Mark, and then John, the latest one. And of course, it's very late because we know that Jesus died between 30 and 33, 34 AD. So if this is the earliest gospel that we have, that's well 35 to 40 years after Jesus died. So that's a lot of time. And during this time, remember that there was the siege of Jerusalem by Romans, there was the Jewish riot, and the Romans came in and then they destroyed the temple. So many Jews fled the city, they escaped. So if the Gospel of Mark, that was the earliest one, was written so late, then it's very likely that the eyewitnesses wouldn't be alive, or that it wouldn't be so easy to find the eyewitnesses to actually include their testimony in the Gospels. And if Matthew and Luke as well wrote even after that, especially Luke wrote after that, Luke is quoting a lot of Mark, but then has its own sources. But again, this late, there were probably no witnesses alive. So you can trust that, right? You can't consider what Luke is writing direct eyewitness testimony, but it's like reports of eyewitnesses. So it's reports of reports. And therefore, the credibility just decreases. Of course, it's still possible to think that they are reliable, right? But it's less likely to be direct eyewitness testimony. And that's the huge thing, right? Because if we cannot trust the Gospels to contain eyewitness testimonies, then it's very likely that, for example, the Gospels contain legends, contain facts that were added later to embellish the story, to attribute to Jesus supernatural powers of things that he didn't actually perform or said, just to add more to the religion and try to spread it more, right? So the witnesses wouldn't be alive to disprove these facts because they would be dead. So that's the huge implications of this late dating of the Gospels. And very interesting, if you just continue with the first page here, you're gonna find some websites that are gonna object to the fact that the dating of the Gospels can be even earlier than that what most scholars agree with. And then instead you find some websites instead that are gonna argue that instead the Gospels were written well at the end of the first century. So I've taken examples, these two websites. One is gonna echo Bart Ehrman's quotes from his book, and Bart Ehrman again is one of the most prominent skeptic scholars about the Gospels and the New Testament documents, and he argues that no, because he just doesn't believe that supernaturalism is true, then of course prophecies cannot exist, miracles cannot be possible, and so on. So he dates, for example, the fact that again, because we have the prediction of destruction of the temple, right? That the Gospels were written probably, right? At least it's probably, but after 70. And then of course, if we date Mark so late, 70 AD, then that means that Matthew and Luke are after. So it's just everything is after. And as you see here, down here, that even though these are rough guesses, most scholars agree on them. So I would really like to see which are these most scholars, and if they all have the same bias against supernaturalism, because I know a lot of scholars instead do not have this bias against supernaturalism, and they reach a complete different conclusion based on the data, on the evidence. So that would be pretty interesting to compare. But now the huge problem with this argument is, first of all the historical implications that followed it. Because if we go back here to this late dating of Luke, see, it's 85 to 90 AD. Luke, remember, that wrote both Luke and Acts. And it's especially the book of Acts that tells us different things that happened and that we shouldn't find, and instead doesn't tell us things that we should find that instead are not there. So it's like if book of Acts was written so late, probably like after 90 AD, then why is it that we don't find any hint about, again, the destruction of the temple, siege of Jerusalem, all the persecutions of the Christians, different allegations? I think I have, this other website that is just, it's very interesting because it just says all this. For example, here, the Jewish war and the fall of Jerusalem, the persecution, the death of Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, theological disputes, the fact that, for example, the Gentiles should be circumcised, and all that discussions that we have a lot in the book of Acts. Then the fact that there was the Judaism and Christianity together, and especially these 5 points according to this website. So why is that in the book of Acts, that supposedly was written after 90 AD, so well after, for example, here Peter died, Paul died, James died, after the persecution of Christians, after the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple? So why is that, if the book of Acts was written so late, that we don't have any kind of information, hints of these events in the book, right? Is it possible that Luke purposefully left all these events aside, trying to justify and trying to make it appear as if the book was written so early? It's very, very unreasonable, right? Especially if we consider the fact that, for example, Luke doesn't say anything about the persecution of Christians in Rome, but then he says about other persecutions. So Luke records certain events, but then he doesn't record others. So, like, it's very interesting, right? As if Luke was actually writing in a time where those persecutions didn't happen. And again, here, the deaths of very important figures. If you read the book of Acts, Peter and Paul are super central figures of the book. So why is that? For example, we have records of the death of Stephen, of the James of Zebedee, and we have other disciples and Christians, but then we have nothing about the death of Peter, Paul, and James, that were much important figures. And again, we have pretty specific dates when these characters actually died. And again, so it's very weird, right? Why is Luke not even mentioning these deaths if the book was written so late? And then we have these very interesting two last points. Instead, this is information that we do find in the book of Acts, but we shouldn't be able to find it if the book was written so much later, because of the fact that after the 70 AD, when all the Jews fled Jerusalem, Christianity became permanently Gentile-centered. So it wasn't anymore, like, the Jewish disputes weren't so present anymore. So again, there is no reason for Luke instead to insist so much on certain aspects between Judaism, and Christianity. And again, so we have instead this information that we shouldn't have if the book of Acts was written so late. And again, if we just follow this reasoning, all right, of just the book of Acts, so we are trying to agree with this supposition, right, that the book was written so late. But again, we have evidence that goes against it. So, like, the book of Acts cannot possibly be so late, because of all this evidence mounting up. Like, it's very unreasonable to think that the book of Acts was written so much later. And it's instead is much more reasonable to conclude that the book of Acts actually was written before these events take place. And that's why there are no hints about this. And it's like a modern biographer writing an account of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King or Kennedy, but failing to mention their assassination. So again, it's very unreasonable, right, to think that the book of Acts was written so late and doesn't mention all these events. And because of this early dating of just the book of Acts, then we can go back in time, right? Because that means that Luke wrote the gospel before this around 65 AD. So we just go back in time. Therefore, that means that Mark was written before Luke. And so we finally arrive to between 40 and 50s AD, where probably Mark was written. And that's, again, as I said, very close, because that's 15 to 20 years after Jesus died. So that's well within the eyewitnesses' lifespan, and so that they would be alive to actually report and so that they could record their testimonies in the Gospels. Then we have other evidence here, but I'm not going to go through that now because it's just I don't think it's important to the main objection. As I said before, is the fact that the prediction of the temple, right? And again, this is the main reason why skeptics say that the book of Mark, especially, so the earliest gospel, must have been written after AD 70, because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. But because prophesying cannot be possible, then that means that the book was written after the event happened, and then the authors included the prediction as if Jesus had made it. And yeah, Jesus predicted both the Jewish temple destruction and also the destruction of the temple of the city of Jerusalem. And again here, as I said before, this is a philosophical objection, not an historical one. And again, it's just the bias against supernaturalism. It's the fact that they just presuppose that only naturalism can exist, and so all the evidence must adapt to this naturalism rather than instead following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to a supernatural explanation. And again, we have more logical arguments to try to refute this objection. For example, the fact that the authors never recorded the fulfillment of this prophecy, right, of this prediction. Luke, for example, records the fulfillment of this person prediction of a famine, but he never mentions the fulfillment of Jesus' prediction of the temple. So again, why is that Luke is recording this minor prediction and is actually recording the fulfillment of that prediction, but instead is not saying anything about Jesus' prediction that it was, I would say, more important. And again, the fact that there was very common knowledge that if the Jews would rebel against God, the temple would be destroyed. So that was something taken from the Old Testament. So yeah, there was an historical tradition, as you can see here. The disobedience would result in the destruction of the temple. And so yeah, it's not just Jesus, but it's like many other Jewish rabbis that were holding the same view as Jesus. So it wasn't like the predictions would be based on theological convictions rather than personally inspired prophecies. And then again, we have the fact that especially I think this last argument is super convincing. The fact that if actually these predictions were written after the fact, then would we expect these predictions to be more precise? And actually there are a lot of slightly mistakes, if not weird, like wrong things recorded that wouldn't be there if the predictions, like if the events had already happened. For example, the fact that the Matthew statement says about the setting the city on fire, right? And because the city was burned after the 70, right? Then this must not be true. But in reality, you can see that the temple was burned down. So again, it was a kind of mistake, if you can call it like that, right? The gospel is saying something about a prediction, but that didn't happen like that, but it happened slightly in a different way. For example, the fact that Jesus told his disciples to pray that it may not happen in the winter, and while we'll know instead that the Romans destroyed the temple in the summer. So again, all these slight different mistakes in the predictions, right, of what would happen, then makes us believe that, you know, these predictions were actually before the event happened and not after, because if they wrote them after, they would be more precise. And again, here, the fact that Jesus told his disciples to flee the mountains, when instead other historians say that the Christians fell to Pella, that is instead lower than Jerusalem. So yeah, all these little mistakes, if you can call it like that, in the records really push us to believe that the writers wrote before the events actually happened and not after. And yeah, so this is pretty much the video I wanted to make. So despite the fact that the main philosophical claim that the Gospels couldn't have been written before this date, it's a philosophical claim, as I said before. It's just based on the assumption that supernaturalism cannot be true. There is no historical evidence for any of this. And again, instead there is evidence, and logical evidence, that the book of Acts cannot be possibly have been written so late, and that because it doesn't contain a lot of information, or because it contains useless information. And again, if we just go back in time, then we have the book of Mark being written pretty early. And again, the fact that even if we have the prediction of Jesus of the destruction of the temple, that doesn't make the books any false, or like force them to be placed later in history, because again, we have other pieces of evidence that make us understand that the Gospels couldn't have been written so late. So yeah, that was it, guys. So I hope that you enjoyed this kind of different video. And yeah, see ya, stay well. Thanks for watching.